Thanks a million. I feel exhausted just listening to that. So I know at the end of the day, I have the benefit, I suppose, of maybe asking to step back a little bit. I've been listening to some of the panelists talking about digital transformation, and what I realized I wanted to talk to you about today is that all of us have become used to living in what they used to call the information economy. I kind of think it was like the attention economy. We had a whole economic system built around the idea of grabbing your attention. You were the product, right? We all wanted to get people's eyeballs because we're all selling services to you. Well, I want you to think about the idea that perhaps at this moment in time, we're going through this entire correction where we're entering into a trust economy, where the basic currency of going forward for any business that relies on a relationship with an individual will be building trust with them, not attention grabbing. And I really don't have a lot to tell you except it's derived from my own personal life story. So I was asked by someone last week, I hadn't seen for 30 years, they say, what do you do? And I couldn't really describe what I do anymore. Sometimes I'm in a room I'm called a digital pioneer, which is generally people saying, I have no idea what you're talking about. Sometimes they call me a digital veteran, which means I'm the oldest person in the room. I'm really all my life have been a storyteller. My father was an accountant, by the way, but I didn't learn that from him. I learned how to tell stories. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit was in my lifespan, I turned 50 about 3-4 weeks ago. When I was born, this is the world of storytelling. So when you were born in the 60s, as I was, or in the 50s, stories were basically owned by storytellers. Everybody else gathered around televisions and radios or bought newspapers. And we, the storytellers, had control over the means of production. Because we owned the satellite dishes and we owned the radio transmitters and the printing presses, and everybody had to gather around. So it wasn't that hard to build trust with your audience because they had no alternative. You were someone like this man, Ed Murrow, one of my childhood heroes. This guy was one of the most famous and influential American broadcasters of the television age. He's well known for back in the Second World War. He would broadcast from the rooftops of London during the Blitz. A very brave man. He stood up to Senator McCarthy and his anti-communist witch hunts in the 50s. He showed what a true figure of trust used to be. Because now we're in a different age. Today, everybody can be a storyteller. If you have a mobile phone, a connection to a social network, you're a storyteller. So all the rest of us, the journalists, are all competing for your attention. We're all fighting for relevance. Jim Acosta, poor man, CNN, White House press briefing room just a couple of weeks ago, literally having the microphone grabbed from him. Because now, according to Donald Trump, the media are the enemy of the people. We no longer command trust. So I'm fascinated by how we trust storytellers, how society values trust in stories. And what I mean by stories is everything from people writing books to people sharing information about their products. So the whole range of stories that we in business tell about ourselves. We're living through a disruption of historic proportions. My story begins here. I haven't changed a bit, right? This seems like yesterday to me. It'll seem like ancient history to you. This is my first publicity photograph from RTE. If you look behind me, this was the journalism I used to do. In the background here, we have these tapes. They're magnetic, reel-to-reel tapes. We used to slice it up with a razor blade. That's how you made radio. If you look at the telephone that I'm using, the size of the computer, in the space of a lifetime, journalism has changed so much that it's almost eye-watering to look back. I went on to become an anchorman, so I worked for Primetime beside Miriam O'Callaghan. And my job was essentially to sit in the studio like the voice of God and tell you what the news was that day. I had control of everything. You had to trust me. I was the only person on television that was telling you the news. But I started to realize something that scared the bejesus out of most of my friends in journalism. About 2009, along came Twitter. So Twitter allowed me to do something remarkable. It used to be that I couldn't talk to the audience directly. You couldn't talk to me. You just sat there passively. Suddenly Twitter allowed me to ask people on Twitter to give me questions because it was the middle of a financial crisis. You know, confidence in the financial system and journalism to a large extent, we didn't know it then, was collapsing. I could walk out virtually on Twitter and say, listen, I got the Minister for Finance in the studio tonight. Do you have a question? What amazed me was in the direct message channel, I would get people who were estate agents or in banks who would give me information by Twitter that was way more complex, sophisticated and useful than anything I could read in that day's papers. And so I started to fall in love with the idea that this new democratic awakening with social media was making me a better journalist, allowing me to allow the users, the audiences to speak truth to power directly to me. I was also a foreign correspondent at the time, so I used to travel around to war zones, places like Iraq, Afghanistan. This is Iran. And I fell in love with Iran. It was one of those stories, and any foreign correspondent will tell you this. They fall in love with a country, and Iran was that country. And back in 2009, the same time I discovered Twitter, there was a revolution on the streets of Tehran. Revolution is probably too strong a word, but young people like this were rising up in protest at a disputed election. No journalists were allowed to cover this because the Iranian government kept them away from the streets. I couldn't go to Iran because there was a financial crisis in RTE. They couldn't send me. I sat home watching on Twitter. And what I found out was young men and women like this were giving far more authentic, direct testimony about what's happening on the streets of northern Tehran than all the journalists I was listening to were locked away in hotel rooms. And I suddenly realized there's a democratic revolution here. What if I could work with people like this to get their stories out? Suddenly, you don't have to be a journalist to tell a story to a mass audience. You could just have your camera phone and a social network. If everybody can tell a story, here's the problem. Who do you listen to? And I thought to myself, with my journalistic training, I could set up a news agency and we would just work with people who were spreading information that was worth hearing, worth seeing on social media. And that's where the idea for Storyful came about. I set that business up. We just coincided with the revolutions across the Arab world. We were building newswires for YouTube and Facebook, New York Times, BBC. Every big newsroom in the world within about 2 or 3 years had our service in their newsroom, all staffed by a small group of journalists back here in Dublin. Now, Storyful was a big success in one sense. We were named the most innovative companies in the world. We were bought by News Corporation in 2013. And I look back and everybody tells me how successful it was, and a little piece of me doesn't feel it was that successful. So we were told we were innovative because we kept social media honest. How'd that work out? I look back and I think to myself, I couldn't have seen, even back when this was written, back in 2014, the scale of information overload that was flooding the world. And this was what I realized in retrospect, the mistake I made. I thought that we could just fact check the hell out of the internet and bring back trust to information flows. And I didn't reckon with this statistic. Today, the average American, and I would argue most people in the Western world or developed world, anywhere with cell phones and communication systems, consumes 5 times as much information as they did back in 1986. And what happens when you're overwhelmed by information? You kind of tune out. This is more recent, June 2018. This is 68% of American adults feel worn out by the amount of news there is today. Now, clearly it's a busy news year with Donald Trump and Brexit and all those kinds of things, but people are reacting to this information overload by tuning out. They're also reacting, and this is where the conversation I had with Lisa earlier on is fascinating, by going back to biases that are built into us. They're called heuristics. These biases in our brains, when we're faced with overwhelming choices, allow us to make decisions very quickly. They're generally based on very bad criteria for decision making, like confirmation bias. If I hear something that feels true, I'm more likely to believe it. Recency bias. Whoever told you the last thing you need before you make a decision is probably the person you listen to. And so there's a great pollster in America. He's a guy called Nate Silver, one of the only guys I've seen recently who gets his predictions right. He wrote a book, Signal and the Noise, in which he says we face danger whenever information growth outpaces our understanding of how to process it. When the printing press was invented back in the Middle Ages, it led to the most violent period of human history. And more recently, when social media came along and disrupted these trustworthy channels of communication, we faced into unprecedented global political upheaval. It's no accident, because in an age of information overload, people tend to go toward the loudest voice, the one that makes them feel something deep, whether it's outrage or desolation or joy. That's where people tend to go in an era of information overload. And the second piece of the puzzle is the fact that predominantly Facebook has become the biggest news distribution network known to humanity. And what does it trade on? It trades on emotion, because its systems are built on advertising. Advertising that is worked by algorithms, that essentially takes somebody's emotions and connects that with someone who's trying to sell you something. So these systems were not designed for quality. They were not designed to help you sort out truth from hoax. They were designed to make you feel something because that makes you more likely to buy it. If you could invent a recipe for the erosion of trust in storytelling, this would be it. And as a consequence, in the United States, just last year, 32% of the people had trust in the media, way back from those glory days of the 1950s. And if you look closer to home, this is Donald Trump talking about this gap. He's talking about now that the media are not just distrusted, but they're enemies of the people. Because into the gap that emerged as people distrusted media, charlatans like this guy come along and fill that gap with their own brand, turning us into the enemy of the people. And it's happening all over the world. You can't see all the details, but if you look closely, this is more recently, 2 months ago, Ipsos, the pollsters in Britain, they gauge every year the veracity index. What do people feel about trust for people in public life? You notice there's something interesting happening about midway point. Journalists are down here, just below estate agents, just above government ministers, which in itself is a statement. But if you look around the middle, top points of all the people that are most trusted in our societies are the people that are not trying to sell us things. They're the people who are doing something out of public service, public utility. It's only you start getting down to people who are selling us things that you see trust dropping off in pretty dramatic fashion. So essentially what we're saying is, in our lives today, we distrust people that are trying to sell us something. We distrust people whose relationships with us are based on something more than simply our own interests. And I think that's the key to understanding how difficult it is for all of us, not just those who are journalists, but people who are in business, who are trying to create relationships with consumers and customers, with individuals. Now, there's good news on the horizon, at least there was this year for journalism. I think people are so completely lost trust in platforms like Facebook after the events of last year. We've seen like a bounce back now. Trust in platforms, technology services like Facebook are dropping, while trust in journalism, at least in Ireland, according to this Edelman Trust Barometer this year, is going up. You can also see other really strong signs, and it also comes particularly from younger people, because as people start getting conditioned to pay for quality content like Netflix and Spotify, we're seeing a rise in the number of younger people. This is 18 to 24-year-old Americans paying for news online. Back in 2016, only 4% of people around your age group paid for news online. A year later, it was 18%. A lot of it has to do with the kind of shock at Trump's election. But the research tells us that the more people feel like they're paying for something of quality, and that distinguishes it from the crap, they're happy to pay. They're happy to go out and put money, take it out of their pockets and hand it over to people who give them quality. So that's the first good sign. But they want and they demand a new relationship with businesses. It can't be enough for the old days when I was a journalist just to sit there and tell you passively, you are the audience, you will listen to me. People are demanding more productive experiences. This is a fascinating study done by an app called Moment, commissioned by a movement called Time Well Spent. It's now called the Center for Humane Tech. I'd really recommend you check these people out. What they found was the app experiences that leave us deeply unhappy are the ones that addict us. We get really unhappy with Facebook after 22 minutes, and yet we spend, or at least the Americans spend, on average 59 minutes a day on Facebook. What's that about? Well, what's happening is on the right-hand side, the most unhappy apps are using all these techniques to catch your attention, get you just continuing to refresh that app. What's going to happen next? Who am I going to talk to? Who's going to like my piece of content? They're the really unhappy experiences. The ones on the left in green, these are things like mindfulness apps. These are apps that help you navigate traffic, navigate things in your life. We go in, we take 5-10 minutes with them. They give us something back, something useful in our daily lives. They make us feel empowered. We're really happy with those apps. This is the future. It's a future in which you look at your phone and you know that you've got apps to help you control all parts of your life, from your sleep, your exercise, the amount of calories you take in every day. I think more and more news, information, relationships with businesses are going to have to feel like those kinds of apps. that give you some utility in your life, that you know have your best interests at heart and can give you something and let you get out and get on with your life in a more productive way. I feel that's the future. So I've banked on my second startup, the difficult second album. I'm working with some of the same people from Storyful, and we're working on the big problem for journalism, which is when you get up every day as an ordinary person, you are overwhelmed by choices. And you've only got 10 minutes sitting on the bus, going on the dart, cycling to work. Can you get news that's just going to give you what you need for your day? To respect your identity, to respect your intentions, to reward your attention. So we're building an app called Kinzen. It's a user experience you can get from a mobile app come January. Come along. We're opening this entire project up. It's a collaboration. You can come at kinzen.com, join our test group, be a curator. It's completely open. We're launching in January, and we're hoping that we can change the way that people consume news to give them that sense of agency, power back in their life when it comes to news. And while my business model might be very different to the businesses that you'll work with, that I hope you'll found, that you'll lead as you go forward, I want you to think about this central question about the correction we're living through. This book by Tim Wu called The Attention Merchants is probably one of the best books I've read about this moment of change from this attention economy to trust economy. And he's been watching how in advertising there's cyclical ups and downs. We're at one of these downs now where people's trust in advertising has fallen away. And there is a chance perhaps that people have become aware of the manipulation that they've been put under for the last 10 years particularly, and they're ready for a correction. They're ready for a new relationship to businesses. So I would say it like this. I fell in love with this concept of here comes everybody. There's a guy called Clay Shirky, he's a great theorist, and he wrote about the first democratic wave of platforms like Twitter that so entranced me. And he said, here comes everybody. We all get a chance to be part of content creation and sharing and distribution. And it was the first rallying call of many people who set up businesses in the first days of social media. I would say it's now changed. Business in this new trust economy will thrive or it will die on the basis of relationships with individuals. We are no longer crowds. We're no longer audiences. We can no longer be segmented by gender where we live in cities. We're all individuals who demand a return on our identity, who demand a reward for our attention, but most of all, we demand that businesses form relationships with us that give us power in our lives. I bet what we're going to start seeing much less of is the Facebook philosophy or the Google philosophy of we will do it for you. And a lot more of the philosophy that people like Apple and Microsoft live up to, which is we will give you the power to have more productive lives. And in that division, that sounds like a philosophical division, there is real change happening. And as you think about trust and privacy and your own identity, your own self of self-governance, I would say we've got to develop business relationships that respect the individual. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to leave it here and look forward to talking on the panel. Success in this economy that will be all around building trust between the individual and business is about understanding that you as a business leader, someone advising a business, has to respect the fundamental interest of that individual. You have got to give them power in their daily life. That's the secret of the trust economy. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm kind of banking my future on it. But I look forward, hopefully, to seeing people like yourselves building real platforms that change people's lives in a whole new environment. That's it from me. Thanks very much for listening to me, Lisa. Thank you.